Our first speaker is Nickie Norman. She was raised on Eden Beach, which is 12 miles southwest of Troy. You might be able to find it on the map. And she's experienced all of the wildness of this area. Growing up, she helped tend cattle and horses, and traveled the roads with her father, who was the county road department, managed the county road department based out of Troy. Nickie went on to marry Tim Norman and create a life in the arts. Oops, excuse me. Together they built and ran the Norman Arts Foundry and Norman Arts Gallery. Okay, and please be careful when you come up here. We do have kind of a lot of flyers. Okay, Nickie Norman.
Thank you, Dawn. I've kind of written something about my family's history, and I'm just going to read it for you. My family's history in the North Country began somewhere around 18.
Could you stand closer to the mic, please?
We got a bit of.
My family's story started in the North Country somewhere around 1897, when my great-grandparents, Andrew and Magdalena, came along up to a place called Eden. It was a beautiful bench on the banks of the Grand Run River. Looking across the canyon, you look at Middle Point in the Promised Country of Wallowa County. There were others homesteaded near there, and they decided this would be home. The homestead papers were recorded in 1904. My dad was the youngest of 4 living children. When he was somewhere around 14, he mounted his horse for the journey across country to go to high school in Lostine. He left the ranch, rode down into the canyon to ford the Grand Round, climbing the other side to come out on Middle Point and then proceed to find his way to Lostine, excuse me, where he milked cows for room and board. He and his oldest brother, Chester, would later become partners in the Hafer Ranch after Harvard returned from World War II. Chester and his wife Mildred raised 6 children, Barbara Bernice 3 on the ranch. The houses were separated by a large garden. Mildred and her daughters worked their side and we worked ours. We grew vegetables to can, and being on the breaks of the Grand Round, we had success most years. The horse and the milk barns, as well as all the corrals, sat on the other side of Chester's house, past the garden and our house. I came into the picture in 1962, 13 years younger than my brother Steve and 14 years younger than my brother Ken. I was 13 years younger than my closest cousin. In these years, my mom had moved to Anatole, Washington for my brothers to attend high school. In the weekends and on the summers, we came home back to the ranch for the boys to work in the fields and for myself to play with my new puppy, a Pomeranian I named Daisy. And so I could convince my cousin Phyllis to take me riding. When I was about 4 years old, my dad moved the old Eden School building up the road with a cat to attach to our small house. Eden School had closed, so any children on the bench would have to travel the 12 miles down to Troy to go to school. We had a little 3-hole outhouse out away from the house that we used. I don't know why there were 3 holes. We never used them all at once. I guess it was emergencies, right? You never know. And then, once the big house was attached to ours, there was room for indoor plumbing. So no more baths in the little tub in the kitchen or going out in the dark at night. The water from both houses and the animals was from a spring, gravity fed, that was a fair distance from the houses. It took work and a lot of time to keep the spring dug out and clean. There was no pumps, no electricity. We didn't have electricity, so there was no pumps to keep that water coming to the houses. We had, our lanterns were lit. I should say we had kerosene lights to light our houses in the evenings. Our refrigerators and stoves were propane. At some point, my dad came up with a small gas generator. We called it the light plant because it lit the lights in the evening and had enough power for our little TV. The reception was so bad that mostly we watched what looked like snow. After some years, Dad was able to get a slightly larger diesel generator that powered both houses for lights, TV, and electric washing and drying. However, you had to run them at different times. It wouldn't power everything at once, so we had to prepare. Living on Eden left you at the mercy of the elements, almost every part of your being. The winters were long and always had snow, at least that covered the fence post. My mom, who I found out in later years didn't really love driving those roads, drove the 12 miles to take me down to Troy to school every day from the time I first started first grade and through 8th grade. For the first couple of years, they made that trip in the evenings to pick me up also. I had the same teacher for the 7 years. I can still remember her beautiful handwriting as she wrote her name on the board every morning. When I was in the 2nd grade, my dad went to work for the county road department, so I would ride with him going home each night. Unless in the winters he needed to take the grader out to plow the road out the next day. I don't remember very many snow days. As Dad and I drove along, he would occasionally talk about what needed done on the road. He would point out the areas that he needed to pull the ditches so the water would run along the edge and not in the middle of the road, and where we had to watch for rock and mudslides. This gave me an eye for watching the hills and their ever-changing stature. Hafer Brothers raised whole Herefords and farmed fields to feed them. This was dryland farming, so you hoped for a good growing season. Many of the fields were steep, and it took great care to stay safe while swathing and baling the hay. Our equipment was not what you see today, no self-leveling. Sometimes you just had to hang on. In the years that I was growing up, Havers farmed several game commission fields farther down the bench for half the hay. The game commission would feed the elk the half they kept. This place where the elk were fed was on the night place, on the road where we watched and enjoyed all the animals. We calved in the winter so that the cows would be big enough to go into the canyons in the early spring as the grass came along. We also ran cattle on the game commission with other ranchers who brought cattle from Florida, as I'm sure they still do. As I got a little older, my favorite times were when we were riding for cattle. I started going as soon as they would let me go. I was probably 7. After the cows had been in the canyons for a long time to eat the grass and give the calves a good start, we would go down to gather them and bring them back up to the ranch. The canyons were steep in a lot of places. We followed a zigzag pattern down to make it easier to ride and easier on the horses. My first little round mare had no leather, so keeping the saddle on her was difficult. After a few times of sliding up over her head, I usually walked when we were going downhill. The slopes were rugged with areas of large flat places at the bottom with lots of wildflowers, bluebells, daisies. It was beautiful in the spring. And of course, there was always the rattlesnakes. The molten slope was the slope directly below the houses, and it was the steepest of the 2 we used. The hunt slope was farther up and slightly more gradual and a larger flat place at the bottom. After the cattle came home from the canyons, it was usually time for them to go up into the Umatilla forest where we had forest permit. But before the calves were taken up, there was takedown fence to set back up and repair for the winter and animal damage. When the cattle went to the forest, we would leave home in the early morning, trailing them through Game Commission lands to the green gate that was the entrance to the forest lands, pushing them a little farther to encourage them to go into Elbow Creek for the early summer. Sometime around midsummer, we would ride up and find the cows and move them higher up into the area we were allotted to make sure there was plenty of grass for the cows as well as the wildlife. There were ranchers from Bartlett Bench who also ran cattle with us and had forest allotments, so we usually did all this as a group. Late summer, it was the longest days of riding. We would leave home at daybreak, pack our lunches on our saddles, and head for where we thought the cows should be. Usually someone had been up with a pickup to get an idea of where the cattle were by that time. The old cows seemed to know when they saw us coming that it was time to go home for the winter. So they fell in line and pretty much did what they were supposed to. Except for we'd have an occasional yearling that would try to take off and, cause you trouble. These days were long and they made us and our dogs tired, but remained some of my fondest memories. I learned by watching my dad as we rode along to look for tracks or any interesting sight. We were immersed in Mother Nature, everything we did. Dad would flip his hand out as he was riding to draw my attention to a track, whether it was a cow track, maybe elk, or a flower, posies as he called them, maybe calf grain cauliflower, morel mushroom, depending on what time of year we were riding. One of these trips, my dad and I was riding a horse that always got a sore back if the saddle didn't fit correctly. It was one of those days, and we'd stopped in a huckleberry patch for him to pull the saddle off and straighten the blanket. I happened to be riding a colt that year, and I had stepped off to rest and eat some huckleberries. Just as Dad was about to put his saddle back on, a big cinnamon bear rumbled into the huckleberry patch. We weren't sure how the horses or the bear were gonna react. Dad quickly saddled his horse back up, and we managed to get back on without confrontation or either one of us getting bucked off. My daily job on the ranch was to bring the cows in from the fields for milking. My uncle liked to have the cows there by 4:30 or 5. I'd go to the barn, saddle my horse, unless I decided to go bareback, and go out to wherever the cows were that day. Sometimes they'd be in the big fields below the house, so they were easily spotted. At other times they'd be in the field up the road a couple miles where you could count on seeing a rattler or at least a track where one had been. Or out around the North Pond. The North Pond had water all year with plenty of grass. This was about the only place you really had to look for the cows where there was a lot of trees. It was damp and smelled pungent like mushrooms. The trillium grew abundantly in the spring, and I always felt there was an Indian spirit that lived there. My other summer job was to turn the bales off the strings so the mice wouldn't chew the strings. My dad made me a long aluminum pole with a hook on the end, so I'd ride my horse up near the bales, hook it with a pole, and flip it up on its edge so that the strings wouldn't get broken. Lucky for me, when I was in first grade, the Wilsons came to Troy and purchased the resort and outfitters. My lifelong friend Deb came to school. We became friends, and as both of us were horse lovers, we bonded over our horses and our love of riding. As the years went by, we talked our parents into letting us ride the 12 miles to meet on the Eden Road. These trips had to be planned, as we had no phone at the ranch, so a plan was made, and there was no backing out, or an adult was going to have to drive and let somebody know. We planned what time to leave so we could meet about halfway, and then we would ride together, usually to the ranch where Deb would stay the night. And the next day, we'd start out together, only to go halfway and part again. Starting from Troy, by the first 3 miles or so was up the grade, so it took longer on that end than leaving from the ranch and going over the gradual ups and downs of the road. On one occasion, when Deb stayed with me at the house for a couple days, we were riding in what was called the school section out near the North Pond. It was probably about 3 miles from the houses in an area that had been logged some years before. There were down logs, grass, and lots of interesting things to look at. It was an area where you could ride into a herd of elk and listen to the cows talking to their babies. The cows were always there every spring. I had a big rough collie dog that was supposed to be my mom's dog, but he liked to go with me. Deb had her German Shepherd, Duke, that day. We were riding along when we noticed we had 5 coyote pups following us. They just followed along, and we tried to keep the dogs with us. We made it back home with both dogs that day. Our collie did like to play with the coyotes that would come down close to the house. He would run after them and never seemed like he was chasing them, he was just playing. Our house set below was what was sort of a V in the field above it. I remember many times when we would get a hard rain, a gully washer, when the water would run by the edge of the house and down into our woodshed. As a girl, I loved to go out there and play in it. I thought it was great fun. And these times when we had these hard gully washer rains, you knew that you had to watch on the roads. You had to watch for rocks and gully washers and anything that might have changed. The one element that you always also had to be aware of was rattlesnakes. You never put your hands in a plant or a hidden area with out, giving it a shake or poking it with a stick to be sure nothing was in there. I remember my little Pomeranian barking at a snake one time in our yard, and one time finding a snake only a couple feet away from where my dad lay underneath a car that he was repairing. In later years, my husband was working there and he found a snake in the baler. He has a guitar strap from that snake today. He harvested the snake, barbecued it. I wasn't a fan. And he tanned the skin. There's something special about the North Country. I feel its ebb and flow in my soul. The Grand Round smells different than any other river that I've been around. Anywhere you look, you're going to find something really of your paintbrush. A few good places, the bridge above Troy, if you go out from Troy, the road that goes on up into Promise, right there at the bridge is a good spot to look upriver if you happen to want to paint the scenic river. Right out of Troy, the Mill Bar on the Winnehaw is also beautiful and has a pretty dramatic view of what the fires did a few years ago. Just ideas. The roads are still dirty and steep. And, just take your time and be cautious if you go.